Every country owes money. Your country owes money. Even the countries that look rich are drowning in debt. The United States alone owes over $36 trillion. That's more than the entire U.S. economy produces in a year. But how did we get here? How did we go from trading goats and grain to entire nations owing money they can never possibly pay back? The entire history of global debt is wild. And it starts way earlier than you think. Let's walk through it. The beginning, when debt was written in stone, 3000 BC. Before we had paper money or credit cards, we had debt. The first recorded debts date back to ancient Mesopotamia around 3000 BC. Farmers would borrow seeds and livestock, then pay back after harvest. If they couldn't pay, they'd lose their land or become slaves. These debts were literally carved into stone tablets. No forgetting what you owed. Around 1800 BC, the Code of Hammurabi established some of the first debt laws. Interest rates were capped at 33% for grain loans and 20% for silver. If you couldn't pay your debts, you could sell family members into slavery for up to 3 years to clear it. Wild times. Ancient civilizations quickly realized debt could destroy societies. When too many people owed too much, economies collapsed. So rulers started declaring debt jubilees, massive debt forgiveness events where all debts were wiped clean. The Bible mentions these jubilees happening every 49 years. Everyone gets a fresh start. Debts canceled, slaves freed, land returned. But as empires grew, debt became a tool of power rather than something to forgive. The rise of banking and government debt, 1100s to 1700s. Medieval Europe changed everything. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa invented modern banking in the 1100s. Banks created bills of exchange, IOUs that could be traded across borders. Then came government bonds. In 1156, Venice issued the first government bonds to fund a war. Instead of raising taxes, they borrowed from wealthy citizens with promised interest. Revolutionary. Suddenly, governments could spend money they didn't have yet. England followed in 1694 by creating the Bank of England to lend money to the government. The king needed £1.2 million to fight France. The bank lent it at 8% interest. That debt is still technically on the books. France went harder. By the 1780s, half of all government revenue went to paying interest on debt. Not paying down debt, just interest. This directly caused the French Revolution. When people are starving and the government spends half its money on debt payments to rich bankers, revolutions happen. The Industrial Revolution and the debt explosion, 1800s. The 1800s changed debt forever. The Industrial Revolution required massive upfront capital. Building factories, railroads, and mines cost enormous amounts of money, so corporations started issuing bonds and stocks to raise capital. Governments borrowed to build infrastructure. Banks expanded to finance it all. The United States borrowed heavily to fight the Civil War. By 1865, U.S. national debt had hit $2.7 billion, about 30% of GDP. They spent the next 30 years paying it down. Meanwhile, European powers were lending money to countries around the world. When countries couldn't pay back loans, European powers would seize control of their economies or invade outright. Egypt borrowed heavily from Britain and France to modernize. When they couldn't pay in 1882, Britain just invaded and took over the country. Debt as colonialism. Latin American countries borrowed from European banks throughout the 1800s. When they defaulted, European gunboats showed up to collect. This period established a pattern. Rich countries lend to poorer countries, and when debts can't be repaid, the lenders take control. The World Wars and Bretton Woods, 1914 to 1971. World War I was financed almost entirely through debt. Every country involved borrowed astronomical sums. Germany ended up owing so much in war reparations that it destroyed their economy and directly contributed to World War II. After World War I, global debt was chaos. Countries owed each other money in complicated webs. The Great Depression made it worse as economies collapsed and debts became unpayable. World War II made World War I look cheap. The U.S. national debt exploded from 40% of GDP in 1941 to 119% by 1946. Britain borrowed so much from the U.S. that they didn't finish paying it back until 2006. After World War II, world leaders gathered at Bretton Woods in 1944 to redesign the global financial system. They created the International Monetary Fund and World Bank specifically to manage global debt and prevent economic collapse. The Bretton Woods system made the US dollar the world's reserve currency, backed by gold. Other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar. This worked until 1971, when the US had printed so many dollars to pay for the Vietnam War and social programs that they couldn't back it all with gold anymore. President Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility. Now, currencies were backed by nothing but trust in governments. Debt could expand infinitely because it wasn't limited by physical gold reserves anymore. This was the moment global debt truly exploded. The debt supernova, 1980s to 2000s. The 1980s saw debt go absolutely insane. Developing countries borrowed heavily from Western banks. Then interest rates spiked. Countries that borrowed at 5% suddenly owed payments at 15 or 20%. They couldn't pay. Mexico defaulted in 1982. Then Brazil. Then dozens of others. The IMF and World Bank stepped in with bailout loans, but with brutal conditions. Cut government spending, privatize industries, open markets to foreign companies. This became structural adjustment. Countries got loans to pay off old debts, but had to dismantle their economies. It devastated entire continents. Meanwhile, developed countries borrowed heavily too. Reagan cut taxes while increasing military spending. The U.S. went from the world's largest creditor to the largest debtor in less than a decade. The 1997 Asian financial crisis saw Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea nearly collapse under debt. The IMF bailed them out with $110 billion in harsh austerity. By 2000, global debt had reached unprecedented levels. It was about to get worse. The 2008 crisis and infinite debt. 2008 to present. The 2008 financial crisis was fundamentally a debt crisis. U.S. banks had lent trillions in mortgages to people who couldn't afford them, then packaged those bad debts and sold them as safe investments. When housing prices fell and people defaulted, the entire global financial system nearly collapsed overnight. Governments responded by taking on massive debt to bail out banks and stimulate their collapsing economies. The U.S. added $7 trillion in debt between 2008 and 2015. Europe did the same. Central banks started quantitative easing, printing money to buy government bonds. This was completely unprecedented. They created trillions of dollars, euros, and yen out of thin air to keep economies afloat. Then came COVID-19 in 2020. Governments borrowed and spent more in 2 years than in the previous decade. The U.S. added $5 trillion in debt in 2020 alone. Global debt hit $305 trillion in 2024. That's 3.5 times larger than the entire world economy. Every person on Earth would need to contribute $38,000 to pay it off. Japan's debt is 264% of their GDP. The U.S. is at 123%. China's total debt, including corporate and household debt, is over 300% of GDP. Most economists agree this debt can never be paid back. Not fully, not ever. Where we are now. We've created a global financial system built entirely on debt that can never be repaid. Countries borrow to pay interest on old debt. They issue new bonds to pay off old bonds. It's a perpetual cycle. Central banks keep interest rates low to make debt manageable. If rates go too high, governments can't afford interest payments and the whole system could collapse. Some economists say this is fine. Modern monetary theory argues that countries that control their own currency can never truly run out of money. They can always print more. Others warn we're heading for a massive debt crisis that will make 2008 look small. When confidence in currencies breaks, when people stop believing governments can manage their debt, everything falls apart. The entire history of debt spans 5,000 years. Most of that history involves debt jubilees, defaults, and fresh starts. The idea of perpetually growing debt that never gets paid back? That's new. We've only been trying this unprecedented experiment for about 50 years since Nixon ended the gold standard. Debt used to be something you paid back or faced consequences. Now it's just a number that keeps growing, and we all pretend that's normal. Where does it go from here? Nobody knows for certain. Some think we'll muddle through indefinitely. Others believe a massive reset is coming, either through inflation destroying the value of debt or through a catastrophic global financial crisis that forces debt forgiveness. The entire history of global debt is lending, borrowing, defaulting, and starting over. We're living in the longest phase right before starting over. We just don't know it yet.